Hi, Luke. Thanks for agreeing to do this. I was wondering if you could start by talking a little bit about yourself and your research.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of myself, I'm a lecturer in criminology over at Lincoln. I got my PhD a couple of years ago. That was in sociology with a research focus, and as you may have guessed, looking at performance and image enhancing drug users. Where did you want me to start on the research? Sort of how I got into it, or?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, my kind of background was I started first going to like hardcore type gyms, powerlifting, bodybuilding gyms in 2010. I had a friend who we both went to university 2007. We moved back to the Southwest in 2010, and he had got into powerlifting training whilst he was at university. So he invited me to sort of come along and train with him when he was going to these gyms, and just sort of showed me all the different lifts and things like that. And yeah, that was kind of my first experience of people who I was very aware were steroid users. Some very big guys lifting some very big weights at that time. So I trained for a while. I did a couple of powerlifting competitions, actually, just small local ones. BDFPA Opens. That's the drug-free federation. Obviously, not everyone in those gyms were in that federation. And then I was looking to do my PhD, and this was about 2013. And at that time, Professor Ross Coomer was based in Plymouth, and he's obviously done some work on steroids and performance and image enhancers. So I contacted him saying, I'm training in these gyms. I know people who are using steroids. I know people who are selling steroids. Would you be, could I come and do a research piece with you? So that's how I kind of started my PhD. And then some issues, happened at Plymouth, and they closed the School of the Psychosocial Sciences, which is why Ross obviously went to Melbourne. So then Adrian Barton became my supervisor. So we kind of put this project together where it was just an ethnography of my experience in local gyms, just interacting with people, talking to them about their steroid use and what their motivations were, what their beliefs around what the steroids did, and why they were using certain ones. So it really just kind of expanded just from my already being in that environment training.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. And that qualitative element of your research, using that qualitative lens and ethnographic research must have given you some real insight into, as you say, motivations and the reasons people were making those choices about their health and their body.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things that came up when I was kind of analyzing, we almost did a sort of typology, not quite as formal as sort of Christensen's approach to it, but just from talking to the different groups and kind of being in that gym, and experiencing along with people, and sort of asking about their experiences, I got a lot of data which kind of allowed me to get a pretty clear understanding of, really, I had quite a subcultural focus. So in fact, the title of my thesis included there was an exploration of the beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors of performance enhancing drug using subcultures. Because what I found was I would interact with powerlifters, and they would have these very clear beliefs on what works, what you should do, how you should do it, and what the kind of requirements are before you start to do steroids. And then I would talk to the other like more amateur bodybuilders, and then over in kind of like the what tends to be called aesthetics culture and the more social media oriented, and then the kind of subset of that, the lad culture, where it's much more focused on, nights out and looking good, and kind of summer in Ibiza was one of the ones that came up, and just really exploring these different subcultures and their different relationship with drugs. So how their motivations for using the steroids, and what their goals were, short term and long term, informed actually how they went about using them, which of course informs, all the harms around them and that sort of thing. So yeah, just got some really good raw data, and in my thesis really got to bring out the voices of the participants and sort of use their own words. So definitely a really interesting piece from that perspective.
So if for those who are interested in reading more around your study and the ethnographic element to it, and you mentioned this notion of subcultures, were you drawing on particular theories?
So it was quite a broad approach in terms of the theory. I kind of had a grounded theory approach, and it was more or less I was finding the data and then I was exploring the theorists whose work fit to it. So one of the chapters is all about subcultural learning, and it kind of goes through all, Chicago School and all the, Sutherland, and then on to, Burgess and Akers and whomever. So I did have quite a lot of different theories I drew on in relation to subcultures in that chapter, but really it was that grounded theory approach of just going out and, real raw ethnography, finding that data, and then kind of drawing my theory out from the data.
Wow, that sounds absolutely fascinating. So this notion of a theoretical framework being built from the ground up, in a sense, but also blending existing theoretical perspectives. That's what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah. So really just Glaser and Strauss obviously wrote the kind of key text, the introduction to grounded theory, and that was kind of essentially encapsulates my approach. It was just getting out in the field and getting the data, and then just developing that data into the theory, drawing from relevant subcultural theories, relevant theories that I thought kind of matched the data, and just really kind of creating a piece from the ground up, a real bottom up approach to the project.
Wow, that sounds amazing. So before we move on to look at the particular focus of this interview, could you sort of direct us to particular references of your work or particular resources that people could go to learn more about your work around this?
Yeah, so the first place I will direct everyone is, of course, my YouTube channel. So if you just type Dr. Luke Turnock, go on YouTube, and I've got plenty of videos, and you can actually see kind of the evolution of my findings as you watch the videos and how my focus shifts a bit and I refine things. So I think people might find that interesting, just starting in the early videos and moving through to the more contemporary ones. In terms of other resources, if you go on Google Scholar and you just type my name in, you will get a link to the thesis itself, the doctoral thesis, which is 123,000 words. It's quite a substantial piece. I might at some point try and do an abridged version for book form, but that doesn't exist quite yet. So we've got the full one. And then the journal Performance Enhancement and Health. And I think the focus that you want is on markets. So that's probably the key one. If you're interested in markets and policy in relation to the markets, then my article for Performance Enhancement and Health is the one to look at. And it's called Insider Steroid Brewing and Supply Operation in Southwest England. And I think there's a subtitle that it's something to do with it's being an ethnographic case study. That's it. So definitely check that one out.
Fantastic. Well, I'll definitely try and look at that soon. So I suppose you've set the scene there, Luke. Do you want to tell us about that particular focus then?
Yeah, so in terms of the market focus,
yes,
when I was doing the much broader work, so one of the key theories, sorry, I said I was bringing all these theories together, normalization thesis, drug normalization, Parker Measham and Aldridge, and everything that's been written since then. Obviously, this is something that's been talked about by quite a few people. Van der Ven and Mulroney, I know, obviously brought it up in one of their papers, and how, as we're seeing this increase in steroid use or apparent increase, there also seems to be a kind of cultural normalization around it. So as part of my thesis in exploring this idea of normalization and looking at the different ways in which normalization is occurring, obviously Parker, Measham and Aldridge in their work focused on things like access and availability and social acceptance, cultural acceptance, and Kumar, Moyle and South then obviously wrote this piece on the normalization of supply as the other side. So I was exploring access, exploring the availability and the narratives around steroid supply as part of my exploration of beliefs, motives, behaviors more broadly. And I found that supply, particularly at the sort of gym level was very much normalized. People would just, you know, happily supply each other with steroids, and it was well known in gyms who were supplying steroids. So that was kind of the initial kind of market focus. But as it happens, one of the people I knew in the gym, he actually was quite an established steroid supplier, and this type of data I think is quite rare to come across this sort of level in the supply chain. So there had only really been a couple of papers previously that talked about supply above sort of the immediate level in the gym, the retail level, I suppose you could call it. So this person who I knew, I just asked him. I had a qualitative interview with him, and we just spoke for about half an hour in the original interview. But then, you know, I was seeing him at the gym, and I had him on WhatsApp, so I got more data, far more data beyond that. But we just sat down, and I just asked him about his role in the market and how he had got into it. So that's the focus of that paper.
Okay, so what did he say?
Okay, so the first thing that kind of came up was this idea of drift and just drifting into supply, and how, you know, so he was a power lifter, and as a power lifter training in one of the hardcore gyms. I mean, in all the gyms, there's been a normalization of supply. Even in the commercial gyms, people will openly talk about it in changing rooms and things. But obviously in the hardcore gyms, it's a bit more obvious, just because they've kind of got this tradition of having the drugs in their sport. And he said he started off, you know, he just wanted to access steroids, so he just asked someone in the gym who, you know, was happy to supply him. And then he had a friend who told him, oh, actually, this online source who I know can get steroids really cheap, and, you know, if you're buying it in a bit of bulk. So he said he started talking to this person who was based over in Ireland, who would ship the steroids to him, and they were shipping. Yeah. So they started this kind of miniature importation, just a single country away, and he said, you know, once people in the gym became aware that he could get this, what seemed to be quite good quality product, quite cheap, then, you know, more and more people were coming to him. And he says it got to the point where he had about 40 customers who were buying in quite large bulk, and then they were just selling to their friends. And what happened was, this person who his friend had introduced him to online, they then said they were stopping doing their operation, so they were going to put him in contact with the person in China who they were buying the raw steroid powders from. So what happens with steroids is they tend to be produced in nations like China and India in powder forms, often in these sort of legitimate or semi-legitimate pharmaceutical labs, and then they're sold on in powder to people in local markets, who then create a liquid form product locally, which is then injected. So this person in Ireland had been doing that. When he stopped, he gave the person I was talking to, Jim, this information of the company he was getting it from. And Jim, as it happens, had a degree in chemistry, which is probably how the conversation came up of, you might be interested in taking over my role, sort of thing. So he got in contact with this lab in China who started shipping him this product. And he didn't really have the capacity to make a high quality product. He says you can make very basic injectable form steroids just at home, and people will do it using all kinds of oils. Just you know, you just need a generic oil, you need generic alcohol. If you read Llewellyn and Tober's book, Underground Anabolics, they talk about the sort of basic approach to making it, which possibly some questions on sterility and so on there, which we can get into. But Jim, who I was speaking to, he said he actually knew someone who was supplying steroids on a bit of a larger scale than him. So he approached this person and said, hey, I have access to this powder and I have a chemistry degree, so if you want to go in with me, we can set up a proper lab. So they had a spare room in this guy's apartment, and they filled it with lab equipment, and they just started manufacturing steroids locally from these powders he was importing, and yeah, that's how he became this established supplier.
Wow.
And yeah. So he talked to me about kind of how big the operation was, and it wasn't massive. You know, there was a report last year of a group who the police actually busted their sort of homebrew lab, and that was much larger. So Jim said he was only taking home, sort of, he would take home maybe £1,000 or a couple of £1,000 a week. He wasn't massively profiting off it, but he said, you know, it still had quite a lot of spread. So he was down in the southwest, South Devon, and he said, you know, he knew of people up in Glasgow who were powerlifters who were using it. He gave me the name, I won't repeat the name, but a strong man who has done Britain's Strongest Man, who is very established, who was using his product. Yeah, I'm aware of some other, you know, very high level lifters. So it did get a reputation as being a good product because they were getting these powders. And he, as a chemist, was able to test them. He just said, his quote to me was, "Oh, it's just really simple spectrometry." So, like, as far as he was concerned, enabled to, you know, he just did this basic test which enabled him to see, oh, this is actually quite pure powder. And then they were able to manufacture it into a high quality product, and it just became very popular from there.
So moving on from that, and you know what, this sounds, I can only imagine when you were doing this research, you must have felt like your ethnographic work was sort of immersed in a particular sort of Breaking Bad type storyline, I'm sure. But moving on from that, could you tell us a bit about the notion, the illegal and legal side of this? Were they concerned, you know, was Jim concerned about that? And
yeah, so it's really interesting. So the first thing to point out for legality, illegality, is that he had a couple of packages actually seized by HMRC when they were coming into the country. He said because of the time period they were doing it, it happened to be more or less coinciding with the London Olympics in 2012.
Fascinating.
And he said customs suddenly got really strict around 2012. So he had a couple of packages seized, but he said literally they would send out a letter saying, you know, we've taken this and this is, you know, you can't do this again. But basically nothing would happen after that. And you see this in some of the literature around, you know, like Mike Power's book on Drugs 2.0, when they're talking about ordering from the Silk Road. And there's very much this philosophy of, well, anyone could send anybody anything over the internet, so just receiving a package you couldn't possibly get in trouble for. And that does seem to be the case. So he said, oh yeah, I got these letters. He obviously was using a fake name on the packages, a Trailer Park Boys character. So, you know, those letters got delivered, but he said actually they had already kind of insured with the companies. You pay a little bit more and they'll resend packages. And then the companies sort of were adapting how they were delivering based on what was getting seized, what was getting through. I think Alexandra Hall and Rosa Cohen-Wright have written something on that. I can't recall the precise name of the paper, I'm afraid. But yeah, essentially how these, oh, and Giorgio Santonopoulos would be the other author on that piece. But yeah, how it's illegal in that they will seize it. You're not supposed to be doing it, but actually there was this real kind of assumption of, well, actually it's not that bad. I'm not you know, going to get a lot of police attention or anything. And in fact, I sort of asked him quite explicitly. I was like, were you worried, you know, about what could happen? And he didn't even really seem that concerned about police. He was just like, no, there weren't really any concerns about that. And similarly, when we're talking about these kind of illicit drug markets, that's the next part of the paper is talking about, you know, perceptions of violence and is there danger around these markets? And I asked Jim that quite explicitly as well. I said, was there any concern about, you know, other groups who were supplying? And his response was essentially any violence that's kind of around the steroid, the iPad market, that's just linked to other people who were, you know, drug dealers as more conventionally understood, people who sold cocaine and crack. who realized there was a market and they would be able to sell steroids. But actually, if you're just a steroid brewer and supplier yourself and you don't get involved in those other aspects of the market, then he said there's not really any risk there either. So from a kind of risk perspective, it's quite interesting the way that, you know, he was more or less unconcerned, other than taking sort of basic security measures.
So what I find quite interesting about this is that notion of polydrug use, of what you're sort of talking about there. And I suppose I'd be interested to know, it appears to me from what you've just said there that he's saying he wasn't a polydrug user, but he knew that perhaps others might be. And so if link it to sort of criminal activity and so on, not just about the markets, but, you know, how some drugs are associated with violence and so on. Did you pick up on anything on that in your findings about that relationship?
Yeah. So in terms of the polydrug use, it's interesting. All the groups I spoke to used, you know, drugs that weren't iPads, but it's the way in which they kind of negotiated that, and the kind of vocabularies for motive of use around those drugs. So you would talk to powerlifters and there would very much be strong criticism of, these idiots who they'll go out and get drunk and they'll do coke whilst they're on steroids. You're asking for a heart attack. And when we're talking about roid rage, they would all say, yeah, there's this myth that people get roid rage, but what happens is it's people on steroids who then drink alcohol when they're out on nights out and they get in fights. And if you're just, you know, go to the gym, I go home, I eat, I sleep, there's no such thing as roid rage, although there was a little bit of nuance around very particular steroids. So trenbolone and halotestin apparently make everybody angry, but they were saying by and large what gets recorded as these incidents, it's down to this polydrug use, and particularly alcohol. So the powerlifters were very critical of polydrug use that would kind of paint their sport in a bad light, that would get people thinking, oh, the steroids give you roid rage, or steroids give you heart attacks. So they were very resistant to that, and that was more associated with the other groups, like the more aesthetics focused groups and lag culture and so on, which I'll get into in a second. But among the powerlifters, their polydrug use was things like benzodiazepines. It was steroids give me insomnia, or steroids give me mood swings, so I'll take benzos to correct that. A lot of cannabis as well, for the exact same purpose. Cannabis, you know, helps you sleep and can kind of chill you out a bit. So those two were the most prevalent. And then prescription opiates came up a bit, especially I actually spoke to a wrestler, and he was telling me about how bad kind of opioid abuse is in the wrestling community, because they're all constantly in pain from fighting a lot. So he was very critical of it, and he says, you know, his use of steroids and growth hormone and his, you know, smoking of cannabis, he would do those things so he wasn't dependent on opioids. So there were some interesting things around kind of therapeutic application of steroids as well that came through in the work. So that was kind of the sportsmen, if you like, their approach to the drug.
Are we talking specifically about men as well here?
Nearly all men. I mean, in terms of the steroids, as you're aware, my work is kind of an even split. But when I'm talking about steroids, it was nearly all men.
Okay.
Part of that is methodological kind of concerns, right? If I'm just in gyms and I'm just introducing myself to people and asking them about steroids, there is some concern about, you know, approaching women. Is there a suggestion I'm saying you look masculine if I ask that sort of question? And, you know, how is my kind of approaching women in the gym perceived? How is that navigated? So when talking about steroids explicitly, I did tend to err on the side of interviewing men. So I only had one woman I spoke to who used steroids and growth hormone, but a few women talked about their use of fat burners, things like that. So like clenbuterol and those kind of other iPads. So I have some data on that side of things, but by and large, the main data I have on iPad use does come from men.
Okay, sorry, I interrupted you then, but I felt like we just needed to make that clear, because you know, we are going to speak to experts who are also focused on women, so it's interesting to see those methodological concerns, and I can totally see from a if you think about reflexivity in your research, what you're saying, it exactly makes sense to me. So if I was in the situation, then I can imagine I'd probably be making the same decisions you would around that. So yeah, so we were talking about, was it the lad issues around lad behavior?
Yeah. So and this ties in with both the use and supply. So the first thing is kind of I would say the shorter temporal horizons. It's the lads tend to be training for summer. They're using all these steroids so that they look good for going out. And then as part of that also, they're in this kind of culture of hedonic consumption. So it's go out to clubs, it's go out to these places and take drugs. And so there tends to be a lot of this kind of polydrug use of stimulants around that, whether it's cocaine, MDMA, that sort of thing. So although powerlifters, you see some use of stimulants like in the gym, they might take ephedrine, pseudoephedrine to give them more focused training. You don't so much see the use of things like cocaine on nights out as you do with more of what's kind of this laddish culture. So that seems to be, I mean, I had quite a few incidents, mostly actually secondhand, but me reporting it is third hand. So not so much from the people themselves, but from their friends who have raised concerns. So Pete, who I talk about in quite a lot of depth, his friends were all in that kind of milieu, and he said, you know, a good friend of his would go out and he was taking steroids, he was taking fat burners, and then he'd do coke on top of that. And he said he had a heart attack on a night out. And Pete actually said to him, look, you can't keep taking all these fat burners and things and doing this. And he said he just kept on doing it. So there were some concerns being raised by people within these cultures about friends in this culture and their kind of lack of care. And another one he brought up was a friend who had a skin melanoma, and his immediate response, and this I think speaks to more of the concerns around body dysmorphia, which you'll find interesting from the sort of psychological perspective. His response was, well, if I'm going into hospital, I won't be able to like be out. I better inject some melanotan now because I won't be able to use the sunbeds. So that kind of reaction. Now Pete phrased it as, oh, this is the mindset of these lads. So there does seem to be a sort of sociological aspect of not caring and let's just focus on the now and, you know, just YOLO essentially. Obviously Christensen talks about the kind of YOLO mindset, but also, you know, as we're saying about body dysmorphic disorder, I think there has to be some component to that where you can have very real health scares, but you still continue to do the thing that would appear to have been causing those issues.
So you know, traditions of health promotion and health education are often called certain choices in health behavior as feeling like you've got a cloak of invincibility, and it strikes me that that's what I'm hearing in what you're saying. And I wondered if you touched much on something that we're looking at in our learning, which is around the process of social construction, and you did mention it earlier, you know, imagery and visual representations of you know, toned muscularity and what it means to be a man, and masculinity in you know, glossy images in Instagram or watching, I don't know, Love Island. And I wonder how much of that came across in your research.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've had quotes from a few people, both in the sort of lag culture, but also in this more sort of, whether you call it workout culture, aesthetics culture, the sort of not quite there, but still very much focused on the, you know, social media side of things. And, you know, quotes about, oh yeah, you see fitness models, you want to look like him, you want to be him, or the guys saying about, you know, it's all for social media, that's what gets you likes, that's, you know, it very much tied in with social status and popularity, is if you can put these shirtless pics up where you have this, you know, really ripped, attractive look, then that's what kind of gets you popularity now. So there does seem to be a real pressure on conforming, and that ties in with what I was saying, I think, about the temporal horizons, where you talk to the powerlifters who use in lower doses and they seem to be very informed on what they're using. Now, they're obviously there's still harms, there's still risks, they seem to understand that a bit more because they're thinking long term. They're thinking, I want to be competitive in 3 years' time, in 5 years' time. So what is the best approach? Whereas I think, and part of this could be, you know, an age-related thing as well, but I think a lot of these younger guys who are being exposed to a lot of this imagery, as you said, Love Island, before that it was Jersey Shore, Geordie Shore, you know, there's been these shows around for over 10 years now, I would say, and then particularly with you know, Instagram and Snapchat really taking off. There does seem to be this pressure to look a certain way, and that, in my research at least, seemed to be linked with using in a more risky way, because you weren't thinking as long term as the powerlifters. They're thinking, I want to be competitive in a few years' time. I want to set this record. I want to compete at this level by this date. Whereas if you're thinking, I need to get ripped, I need to look good for, you know, social approval, then I think that actually creates more pressure, and that's why you see more risky behaviors in that population.
As part of our learning, we're looking at particular case studies, and there's one where there's a quote of a young man who says, well, yeah, I do need to go to needle exchange, but I'm not a junkie like the others. And I wondered if you picked up anything similar.
Yeah. That kind of rhetoric around what is a good drug, what is a dirty drug, very prevalent. So I had a couple of steroid users who would use terms like smackhead or junkie. So those terms come up quite a lot. There is definitely a kind of desire to distinguish themselves from those kind of perceived bad drug users, and actually within the subcultures themselves, this idea, and Kumar and Hanley Santos also talked about this idea of, yes, I use steroids, but I'm not like these idiots who use them, right? And that definitely came through in my work, particularly, as I said, around the polydrug use. It's, yes, I am using these steroids that can be harmful, but I'm not doing something stupid like drinking alcohol whilst I'm on them. So there very much were these narratives around what is sensible use and what's not. And I think a very interesting one came from a gym owner I was talking to, who was discussing this idea. He was talking about roid rage and talking about, you know, how it can cause domestic violence and things. And then he said, but I understand that medical testosterone, you know, it can really help men who are going through depression when their testosterone drops in their 40s. And it's just interesting, we're talking about the exact same drug, but if it's prescribed, it's good. If it's bought in the gym, then it's bad. So there's definitely some very interesting narratives around that sort of thing.
And that links again to market supply and demand, doesn't it, really? You know, oh no, I got it, you know, on prescription, therefore it can't be wrong or illegal, and so on. So this is all fascinating stuff, and I could talk about all these type of themes for a long time. I wonder, we probably best if we move on a little bit. So shall we move on and maybe talk a little bit about policy around that? Would that be okay with you?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Which sort of policy questions did you have then?
Did you find it in your research, were you drawing on particular acts, or, you know, was there any sort of areas around acts and the criminalization of behaviors and drugs that came up in your study?
I wasn't focusing on sort of specific acts. I mean, the most broadly, I was just talking about the kind of perhaps been done to death, but kind of you know, how effective is prohibition essentially. And so, as well as talking to Jim and getting that kind of real in-depth data in the UK, I also did some online research where I did an in-depth look at a specific bodybuilding and fitness forum, got almost 30,000 forum posts just from the threads looking at steroids specifically, their kind of steroids, and reading through all that and sort of seeing all the processes of how it's all shipped. And so I mean, it's kind of mainstream, but this kind of discussion of actually does criminalizing this stuff actually lead to lower rates of usage? Does it increase harms if you do it? You know, if people are going to the pharmacy and getting testosterone, isn't that better than if people are having to import powders and then someone might be mixing that up in his bathtub and then you're buying it without necessarily having that knowledge? on the subject of which, some very interesting findings from my discussion with Jim. So more broadly, I had talked to some guys who were very specific in which brands you want to buy, and they would cite certain steroid brands and say, that stuff's bad, don't buy that. So Rich, who's a powerlifter, he said, the first one I used was GB Pharma, don't buy that stuff, because that's bathtub brew, which was kind of the slang term that was thrown around for the stuff that someone literally just gets the powder, throws it in the bathtub, throws some oil in, throws some alcohol in, scoops it up, and then puts it in the oven or whatever. So they were saying, make sure you avoid these certain products and make sure you go to the more reputable ones. And some of it is pharma, but of course a lot of the steroids that are labeled as pharma are not pharmaceutical quality at all. They're similarly made this way, and then they have better packaging. So the people who are making them invest a lot more in getting very professional looking labels and boxes, and then they market it as pharma, but it's not at all. So there's this kind of consciousness of actually, in terms of harm reduction, in my online research, there was someone who was based in Serbia, and he would buy, because it's legal to buy there, and he would just go down to the pharmacy, buy actual pharmaceutical testosterone, and then sell it to guys on the forum. So there is something to be said for, actually, if we have these concerns over how is product labeled, and how does anyone know what actual pharmaceutical quality is it therefore safer to just say, okay, let's just have it so people can go and buy it, particularly with something like testosterone, as opposed to some of the other steroids, although I would think the same argument probably applies to all drugs, but perhaps we're getting a little sidetrack if I go off on that tangent.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, when Jim was talking about his product, he said what happened was he and this supplier who set the lab up in this guy's flat, they would create the vials, and then they would put colored caps on to denote what the product and dosage was, but they wouldn't label them. They wouldn't put them in boxes. They would send them out wholesale in that form. Then the guys who were buying it off them to sell on in gyms, they were the ones putting labels on. They were the ones putting them in boxes. Now, why this is significant, of course, is if someone makes a dirty product, Jim, being a chemist, having all this equipment, was, he said, making a very clean product. But you can imagine somebody else who's just importing powder, it might not be such good quality. If they're following similar practice, which seems to be the norm, if all these people selling in gyms, like gym owners and hardcore bodybuilders who are buying it off them, if the norm for them is creating labels and boxes and things themselves, then if a product is bad quality and does cause harm, how can users make an informed decision to switch? Because they'll say, this brand is bad, I will swap to this other brand, without knowing it could be the exact same thing in the vial. And in my online research, when I look at places like Alibaba, where you see these Chinese companies which are selling various hormone compounds, GHRP6, GHRP2 and whatever, a lot of them have a thing where they say, upload your label design, upload your design for the boxes when we send them. So a lot of what people think of as being, the lab that creates the product is actually just a marketing thing that's added on the layer before it immediately comes into the gym, which obviously there's some kind of harm and risk issues around that.
I think that's fascinating, so interesting, and as you say, there's these questions through the process of the production from supply, and the supply chain is very much is it you get what you pay for, or is it like so much more complex than that? And sometimes it's suck it and see, in a sense. Try that one, as you say. I tried this one first and that wasn't for me, and I tried another one, and just I suppose we better get think about wrapping up now, but I suppose one of the things I'd be interested to hear is whether the individuals that you spoke to, Luke, were they concerned about the long-term damage of these choices on their health, on their body?
A very interesting quote which I cite in the thesis is Rich, the powerlifter who I said sort of used the term bathtub brew, and he was talking about now what makes this quote very kind of poignant is he had a scare that he had testicular cancer after using steroids. He talked about, you know, one of his testicles was twice the size of the other, and he genuinely thought he might have cancer, and then it could have been from the use. Now, following this, we have our interview where we're talking about his attitude, and he explains to me, he's like, look, I'm in pain all the time. I have back pain, I have shoulder pain, I have knee pain. If I'm using, you know, human growth hormone to offset that pain immediately, is that more important to me than a worry that in 20 years time I might be at a higher risk for cancer? So there does seem to be this kind of rational calculation element to it, where they're aware that there could be enhanced risks, but, you know, is it worth taking the gamble to achieve what I want? And I think particularly when you're talking about powerlifters, they are aware of harms. Obviously, most of them will say that harms are massively exaggerated when discussed. You know, when talking about media portrayals, they'll say that's ridiculously exaggerated. You know, but they're still aware that actually they could potentially be hurting themselves, and it's just to achieve what I want or to live a better lifestyle. Is this worth it? And in the sort of other groups, the lads, I didn't see quite so much awareness. But as I said, when Pete was talking about his friends, he very clearly understood the harms there. So perhaps in those groups, there is this awareness of harms, but it's the pressures of, you know, needing to fit this ideal in order to fit in might outweigh the kind of concerns for the harms.
So it strikes me very much that, you know, particularly in the lad group, there's something about subscribing to and being prescribed by notions of hegemonic masculinity, and that thing about I'm subscribing to it because I know this is what I want to achieve, but at the same time it's coming back on them the opposite way, and actually by doing that they're reinforcing it, and then the images are coming back, and it's just I'm prescribed to do this because that's what being the alpha male is, and this is what the body should look like, and therefore I'm going to do this, I'm going to do these steroids and go to the gym, and then I'm subscribing to that. And so it's this push-pull factor, isn't it, all the time? And it's about weighing. I suppose it sounds to me like some of your findings were saying individuals weren't in denial, but there was certainly a short-term gain and long-term loss of, you know, maybe bodily functioning in a normal sense through the aging process is put on hold because the short-term gain of being ripped and looking this way is more important to them in that point in their life.
Yeah, and the other thing that's relevant there when we're talking about, you know, the pursuit of ideals for, you know, identity formation, is that a lot of the younger guys I spoke to, there was real concern because we're in, you know, a fairly working class area, even though it's the Southwest, beautiful scenery and so on, but, you know, concern over jobs, concern over future. And I had a few guys who were kind of involved in that lad scene actually say to me separately, and things that they said they weren't comfortable raising with their friends. They would voice real concern over the future, and they'd be like, I don't know what I'm doing with my life, you know, and like voice real concerns. You know, one of them talked about, you know, how he thought of killing himself, and, you know, just this need for identity when you don't necessarily have the traditional kind of roots that they would have had when the kind of manual labor jobs, the industrial jobs have all declined. Now we're moving to a service economy, and there's something to do with that kind of service economy in the whole Instagram thing and in the kind of need to look a certain way. So I think some of it is just, it's escaping from the kind of the psychological harms of feeling that you don't have a purpose. So even though you are causing physical harm to yourself, is there an aspect of, but I'm going to the gym, it gives me purpose, it gives me identity, and therefore I'm not being harmed here. I think that's also a very relevant component to that.
Yeah, this notion of mental health and what is well-being, it seems to be sort of threaded through in some of those points you've just made there. The other thing that I was thinking about is what appears to me is that they're saying it to you, maybe one-to-one, is that it gives them a sense of belonging.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of I think on actually all sides, the kind of what is the appeal to the gym, whichever subculture you're in, it is belonging, it is fitting in. So whether it's we're going in and it's all about hard work and there's no sandbagging and we are real men, we are lifting heavy, I think that is belonging, and you equally see it on the lads side. It's no, we are a group. There's kind of that homosocial bonding element to it. There's that fitting in element, and as part of it, that is the lifestyle of we're all mates, and we all want to be ripped, and that is that is bonding, and that is identity and belonging. So I think all those themes really do strongly tie in.
Wow, fascinating. Well, thanks very much for that, Luke. I'm going to stop the recording now. But that was absolutely fascinating, and thank you so much for the time you've given us here to listen to what is a really valuable and important set of research studies, and good luck with the future stuff.
That's brilliant. I'm glad you found it interesting.
Yeah.